From the macabre minds of Laughing Devil Production comes another story from the Nightshade Diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind, amp up your imagination, and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. The Hairy Ones Shall Dance by Gans T. Field. The story thus far. Talbot Wills, the narrator, has given up a career as a stage magician to study psychic phenomena. Though a skeptic, he is on good terms with Dr. Otto Zoberg, a lecturing expert on spiritism and other occult subjects. Zoberg, seeking to convert him, takes him to an isolated hamlet where a spirit medium of unusual powers is located. Will finds the medium an attractive young woman, Susan Gerd. A seance is held in the Gerd home, where, though all are handcuffed, a strange wolf-like shape moves in the dark. When Susan Gerd's father cries out some sort of accusation, the shape springs upon him and rends him to death. The town constable comes to investigate, inasmuch as Wills is a magician and escape artist, accuses him of the murder. Wills is confined in a cell. When an angry mob gathers to lynch him, he breaks out, flees through the town, and across a snow-covered field towards the Devil's Croft, a mysterious grove which by custom is never entered by the townspeople. As he enters it, he falls exhausted. Lying thus, he realizes that, though a blizzard is raging outside, the grove inside are leaves, moss, flowers, and grass, and that the air is as warm as though it were midsummer. The story continues. It proved something for human habit and narcotic dependence that my first action upon rising was to pull out a cigarette and light it. The match flared briefly upon rich greenness. I might have been in a subtropical swamp. Then the little flame winked out, and the only glow was the tip of my cigarette. I gazed upward for a glimpse of the sky, but found only darkness. Leafy branches made a roof over me. My brow felt damp. It was sweat, warm sweat. I held the coal of the cigarette to my wristwatch. It seemed to have stopped, and I lifted it to my ear. No ticking. Undoubtedly, I had jammed it into silence. Perhaps at the seance, perhaps during my escape from prison and the mob. The hands pointed to 18 minutes past 8, and it was certainly much later than that. I wished for the electric torch that I had dropped in the dining room at Gerd's, then was glad I had not brought it to flash my position to possible watchers outside the grove. Yet the tight cedar hedge and the inner belts of trees and bushes, richly foliaged as they must be, would certainly hide me and any light I might make. I felt considerably stronger in body and will by now, and made shift to walk gropingly towards the center of the timber clump. Once stooping to find the ground on which I walked, I felt not only moss but soft grass. Again a hanging vine dragged across my face. It was wet, as if from condensed mist, and it bore sweet flowers that showed dimly like little pallid trumpets in the dark. The frog-like chirping that I had heard when first I fell had been going on without cessation. It was much nearer now, and when I turned in its direction I saw a little glimmer of water. 2 more careful steps and my foot sank into wet, warm mud. I stooped and put a hand into a tiny stream almost as warm as the air. The frog whose home I was disturbing fell silent once more. I struck a match, hoping to see a way across. The stream was not more than 3 feet in width, and it flowed slowly from the interior of the grove. In that direction hung low mists, through which broad leaves gleamed wetly. On my side its brink was fairly clear, but on the other grew lush, dripping bushes. I felt in the stream once more, and found it was little more than finger deep. Then, holding the end of the match in my fingers, I stooped as low as possible to see what I could of the nature of the ground beneath the bushes. The small beam carried far, and I let myself think of Shakespeare's philosophy anent the candle and a good deed, in a naughty world. Then philosophy and Shakespeare flew from my mind, for I saw beneath the bushes the feet of what stood behind them. There were two in number, those feet, but not even at first glimpse did I think they were human. I had an impression of round pedestals and calfless shanks, dark and hairy. They moved as I moved cautiously closer, as if their owner was equally anxious to see me. I dropped the match into the stream and sprang up and back. No pursuer from the town would have feet like that. My heart began to pound as it had never pounded during my race for life. I clutched at the low limb of a tree, hoping to tear it loose for a possible weapon of defense. The wood was rotten and almost crumpled in my grasp. "Who's there?" I challenged, but most unsteadily and without menace in my voice. For answer the bushes rustled yet again, and something blacker than they showed itself among them. I cannot be ashamed to say that I retreated again, further this time. Let him who has had a like experience decide whether to blame me. Feeling my way among the trees, I put several stout stems between me and that lurker by the waterside. They would not fence it off, but might baffle it for a moment. Meanwhile, I heard the water splash. It was wading cautiously through. It was going to follow me. I found myself standing in a sort of lane, and did not bother until later to wonder how a lane could exist in that grove where no man ever walked. It was a welcome avenue of flight to me, and I went along it at a swift, crouching run. The footing, as everywhere, was damp and mossy, and I made very little noise. Not so my unchancy companion of the brook, for I heard a heavy body crashing among twigs and branches to one side. I began to ask myself as I hurried what the beast could be, for I was sure that it was a beast, a dog from some farmhouse that did not know or understand the law against entering the devil's croft. That I had seen only 2 feet did not preclude 2 more, I now assured myself, and I would have welcomed a big friendly dog. Yet I did not know that this one was friendly, and could not bid myself to stop and see. The lane wound suddenly to the right, and then into a clearing. Here, too, the branches overhead kept out the snow and light, but things were visible ever so slightly. I stood as if in a room, earth-floored, trunk-walled, leaf-thatched, and I paused for a breath. It was more damply warm than ever. With that breath came some strange, new serenity of spirit, even an amused self-mockery. What had I seen and heard indeed? I had come into the grove after a terrific hour or so of danger and exertion, and my mind had at once busied itself in building grotesque dangers where no dangers could be. Having another smoke, I said to myself, "And get a hold of your imagination. Already that pursuit noise you fancied has gone." Alone in the clearing and the dark, I smiled as though to mock myself back into self-confidence. Even this little patch of summer night, into which I had blundered from the heart of the blizzard, even it had some good and probably simple explanation. I fished out a cigarette and struck a light. At that moment I was facing the bosky tunnel from which I had emerged into the open space. My matchlight struck 2 sparks in that tunnel, 2 sparks that were pushing stealthily toward me, eyes of fire. Cigarette and match fell from my hands. For one wild half-instant I thought of flight, then knew with a throat-stopping certainty that I must not turn my back on this thing. I planted my feet and clenched my fists. "Who's there?" I cried as once before at the side of the brook. This time I had an answer. It was a hoarse, deep-chested rumble. It might have been a growl or an oath, and a shadow stole out from the lane, straining up almost within reach of me. I had seen that silhouette before, misshapen and pointed-eared, in the dining room of John Gurd. It did not charge at once, so I might have been killed then, like John Gurd, and the writing of this account left to another hand. While it closed cautiously in, I was able to set myself for defense. I also made out some of its details, and hysterically imagined more. Its hunched back and narrow shoulders gave nothing of weakness to its appearance, suggesting rather an inhuman plenitude of bone and muscle behind. At first it was crouched, as if on all fours, but then it reared, for all its legs were bent. Its great length of body made it considerably taller than I. Upper limbs, I hesitate at calling them arms, sparred question at me. I moved a stride backward, but kept my face in me. "You killed Gerd," I accused it, in a voice steady enough but rather strained and shrill. "Come on and kill me. I promise you a damn hard bargain of it." The creature shrank away and turned, as though it understood the words and was momentarily daunted by them. Its head, which I could not make out, sank low before those crooked shoulders, and swayed rhythmically, like the head of a snake before striking. The rush was coming, and I knew it. "Come on," I dared it again. "What are you waiting for? I'm not chained down like Gerd. I'll give you a devil of a fight." I had my fist up, and I feinted, boxer-wise, with a little waving jerk of the knees. The blot of blackness started violently, ripped out a snarl from somewhere inside it, and sprang at me. I had an impression of paws flung out and a head twisted sidewise with long teeth bared to snap at my throat. Probably it meant to clutch my shoulders with its fingers. It had them. I had felt them on my knee at the seance, but I had planned my own campaign in those 10 seconds. I slid my left foot forward as the enemy lunged, and my left fist drove for the muzzle. My knuckles barked against the huge inhuman teeth, and I brought over a roundabout right, with the shoulder and hip driving in back of it. The head, slant as it was, received this right fist high in the brow. I felt the impact of solid bone, and the body floundered away to my left. I broke ground right, turned, and raised my hands as before. "Want any more of the same?" I taunted it, as I would a human antagonist after scoring. The failure of its attack had been only temporary. My blows had set it off balance, but could hardly have been decisive. I heard a coughing snort, as though the thing's muzzle was bruised, and it quartered around toward me once more. Without warning, and with amazing speed, it rushed. I had no time to set myself now. I did try to leap backward, but I was not quick enough. It had me, gripping the lapels of my coat and driving me down and over with its flying weight. I felt the wet ground spin under my heels, and then it came flying up against my shoulders. Instinctively, I had clutched upward at a throat with my right hand, clutched a handful of skin, loose and rankly shaggy. My left, also by instinct, flew backward to break my fall. It closed on something hard, round, and smooth. The rank odor that I had known at the seance was falling around me like a blanket, and the clashing white teeth shoved nearer, nearer. But the rock in my left hand spelled sudden hope. Without trying to roll out from under, I smote with that rock. My clutch on the hairy throat helped me to judge accurately where the head would be. A moment later, and the struggling bulk above me went limp under the impact. Shoving it aside, I scrambled free and gained my feet once more. The monster lay motionless where I had thrust it from me. Every nerve a-tingle, I stooped. My hand poised the rock for another smashing blow if there was no sign of fight from the fallen shape. I could hear only a gusty breathing as of something in stunned pain. "Lie right where you are, you murdering brute," I cautioned, my voice ringing exultant as I realized I had won. "If you move, I'll smash your skull in." My right hand groped in my pocket for a match, struck it on the back of my leg. I bent still closer for a clear look at my enemy. Had the thing been so hairy? Now, as I gazed, it seemed only sparsely furred. The ears, too, were blunter than I thought, and the muzzle not so. Why? It was half human. Even as I watched, it was becoming more human still. A sprawled human figure. And as it first seemed to vanish in patches, was it clothing I saw, as though through the rents in a bearskin overcoat? My senses churned in my own head. The fear that had ridden me all night became suddenly unreasoning. I fled as before, this time without a thought of where I was going or what I would do. The forbidden grove, lately so welcome as a refuge, swarmed with evil. I reached the edge of the clearing, glanced back once. The thing I had stricken down was beginning to stir to get up. I ran from it as from a devil. Somehow I had come to the stream again, or to another like it. The current moved more swiftly at this point with a noticeable murmur. As I tried to spring across, I landed short and gasped in sudden pain, for the water was scalding hot. Of such are the waters of hell. I cannot remember my flight through that steaming swamp that might have been a corner of Satan's own park. Somewhere along the way I found a tough fleshy stem small enough to rend from its rooting and wield as a club. With it in my hand, I paused with a rather foolish desire to return along my line of retreat for another indecisive encounter with the shaggy being. But what if it could foresee my coming and lie in wait? I knew how swiftly it could spring, how strong was its grasp. Once at close quarters, my club would be useless, and those teeth might find their objective. I cast aside the impulse that had welled from I know not what primitive core of me, and hurried on. Evergreens were before me on a sudden, and through them filtered a blast of cold air. The edge of the grove, and beyond it the snow and the open sky. Perhaps a resumption of the hunt by the mob. A capture and death at their hands would be clean and welcome compared to... Feet squelched in the dampness behind me. I pivoted with a hysterical oath and swept up my club in readiness to strike. The great dark outline that had become upon me took one step closer, and I paused. I sprang at it, struck and missed as it dodged to one side. "All right then, let's have it out," I managed to blurt, though my voice was drying up in my throat. "Come on, show your face." "I'm not here to fight you," a good-natured voice assured me. "Why, I seldom even argue, except with proven friends." I relaxed a trifle, but did not lower my club. "Who are you?" "Judge Keith Purvisant," was the level response, as though I had not just finished trying to kill him. "You must be the young man they're so anxious to hang. Back in town, is that right?" I made no answer. "Silence makes admission," the stranger said. "Well, come along to my house. This grove is between it and town, and nobody will bother us for the night, at least." When I stepped into the open with Judge Keith Purvisant, the snow had ceased and a full moon glared through it, a rip in the clouds, making diamond dust of the sugary drifts. By its light I saw my companion with some degree of plainness, a man of great height and girth, with a wide black hat and a voluminous grey ulster. His face was as round as the moon itself, at least as shiny and much warmer to look at. A broad bulbous nose and broad bulbous eyes beamed at me, while under a drooping blonde mustache a smile seemed to be lurking. Apparently he considered the situation a pleasant one. "I'm not one of the mob," he informed me reassuringly. "These pastimes of the town do not attract me. I left such things behind me when I dropped out of politics and practice. Oh, I was active in such things 10 years ago up north, and took up meditation." "I've heard that you keep to yourself," I told him. "You heard correctly. My servant does the shopping and brings me the gossip. Most of the time it bores me, but not today, when I learned about you and the killing of John Gurd." "And you came looking for me?" "Of course. By the way, that was a wise impulse, ducking into the Devil's Croft." But I shuddered, and not with the chill of the outer night. He made a motion for me to come along, and we began tramping through the soft snow toward a distant light under the shadow of a hill. Meanwhile I told him something of my recent adventures, saving for the last my struggle with a monster in the grove. He heard me through, whistling through his teeth at various points. At the end of my narrative, he muttered to himself, "The hairy ones shall dance." "What was that, sir?" I broke in, without much courtesy. "I was quoting from the prophet Isaiah. He was speaking of ruined Babylon, not a strange transplanted bit of the tropics, but otherwise it falls pat. Suggestive of a demon festival. The hairy ones shall dance there." "Isaiah, you say? I used to be something of a Bible reader, but I'm afraid I don't remember the passage." He smiled sidewise at me. "But I'm translating direct from the original. Mr. Wills is the name? The original Hebrew of the prophet Isaiah, whoever he was. The classic written compilers of the King James Version have satyrs dancing, and the prosaic Revised Version offers nothing more startling than goats." But Isaiah and the rest of the ancient peoples knew that there were hairy ones. Perhaps you encountered one of that interesting breed tonight." "I don't want to encounter it a second time," I confessed, and again I shuddered. "That is something we will talk over more fully. What do you think of the Turkish bath accommodations you have just left behind?" "To tell you the truth, I don't know what to think. Growing green stuff in a tropical temperature with snow outside?" He waved the riddle away. "Easily and disappointingly explained, Mr. Wills. Hot springs." I stopped, still shin deep in wet nose. "What?" I ejaculated. "Oh, I've been there many times in defiance of local custom and law. I'm not a native, you see." Once more his warming smile. "There are at least 3 springs, and the thick growth of trees makes a natural enclosure, roof and walls, to hold in the damp heat. It's not the only place of its kind in the world, Mr. Wills, but the thing you met there is a trifle more difficult of explanation. Come on home, we'll both feel better when we sit down." We finished the journey in half an hour. Judge Purvisant's house was stoutly made of heavy-hewn timbers, somewhat resembling certain lodges I had seen in England. Inside was a large, low-ceilinged room with a hanging oil lamp and a welcome open fire. A fat blonde cat came leisurely forward to greet us. Its broad, good-humored face, large eyes, and drooping whiskers gave it somewhat of a resemblance to its master. "Better get your things off," advised the judge. He raised his voice. "William!" A servant appeared from the back of the house. "Bring in a bathrobe and slippers for this gentleman," ordered Judge Purvisant, and himself assisted me to take off my muddy jacket. Thankfully I peeled off my other garments, and when the servant appeared with a robe, I slid into it with a sigh. "I'm in your hands, Judge Purvisant," I said. "If you want to turn me over—" "I might surrender you to an officer," he interrupted, "but never to a lawless mob. You'd better sit here for a time and talk to me." Near the fire was a desk, with an armchair at either side of it. We took seats, and when William returned from disposing of my wet clothes, he brought along a tray with a bottle of whiskey, a siphon, and some glasses. The judge prepared 2 drinks and handed one to me. At his insistence, I talked for some time about the seance, and the events leading up to it. "Remarkable," mused Judge Purvisant. Then his great shrewd eyes studied me. "Don't go to sleep there, Mr. Wills. I know you're tired, but I want to talk lycanthropy." "Lycanthropy?" I repeated. "You mean the science of the werewolf?" I smiled and shook my head. "I'm afraid I'm no authority, sir. Anyway, this was no witchcraft. It was a bona fide spirit seance with ectoplasm." Snorted the judge. "Witchcraft, spiritism. Did it ever occur to you that they might be one and the same thing?" Inasmuch as I never believed in either of them, it never did occur to me. Judge Purvisant finished his drink and wiped his mustache. "Skepticism does not become you too well, Mr. Wills, if you'll pardon my frankness. In my case, you saw something very werewolfish indeed not an hour ago. Isn't that the truth?" "It was some kind of trick," I insisted stubbornly. "A trick that almost killed you and made you run for your life?" I shook my head. "I know I saw the thing," I admitted. "I even felt it." My eyes dropped to the bruised knuckles of my right hand. Yet I was fooled, as a magician. I know all about fooling. There can be no such thing as a werewolf. "Have a drink," coaxed Judge Purvisant, exactly as if I had none yet. With big deft hands he poured whiskey and soda into my glass and gave the mixture a stirring shake. "Now then," he continued, sitting back in his chair once more, "the time has come to speak of many things." He paused, and I, gazing over the rim of that welcome glass, thought how much he looked like a rosy blonde walrus. "I'm going to show you," he announced, "that a man can turn into a beast and back again." He leaned toward the bookshelf beside him, paused for a moment, then laid 2 sizable volumes on the desk between us. "If this were a fantasy tale, Mr. Wills," he said with a hint of one of his smiles, "I would place before you an unthinkably rare book, one that offered in terms too brilliant and compelling for argument the awful secrets of the universe, past, present, and to come." He paused to polish a pair of pince-nez and to clamp them upon the bridge of his broad nose. However, he resumed, this is reality, sober if uneasy. And I give you not some forgotten grimoire out of the mystic past, but 2 works by 2 recognized and familiar authorities. I eyed the books. May I see? For answer, he thrust one of them, some 600 pages in dark blue cloth, across the desk and into my hands. 30 years of psychical research by the late Charles Richet, French master in the spirit investigation field. He informed me, faithfully and interestingly translated by Stanley DeBrath. Published here in America in 1923. I took the book and opened it. I knew Professor Richet slightly. Years ago, when I was just beginning this sort of thing, I was entertained by him in London. He introduced me to Conan Doyle. Then you're probably familiar with this book, yes? Well, the other, and he took up the 2nd volume, almost as large as the Richet and bound in light buff, is by Montague Summers, whom I call the premier demonologist of today. He's gathered all the lycanthropy lore available. I had read Mr. Summers' Geography of Witchcraft and his 2 essays on the vampire, and I made bold to say so. This is a companion volume to them, Judge Purvisant told me, opening the book. It is called The Werewolf. He scrutinized the flyleaf. Published in 1934. Thoroughly modern, you see. Here's a bit of Latin, Mr. Wills. Intrabunt lupi rapaces en vos non parentes regi. I crinkled my brow in the effort to recall my high school Latin and began slowly to translate, a word at a time. Enter hungry wolves. Save that scholarship, Judge Purvisant broke in. It's more early scripture, though not so early as that bit about the hairy ones. Vulgate for a passage in the Acts of the Apostles, 20th chapter, 29th verse. Ravenous wolves shall enter among you, not sparing the flock. Apparently, that disturbing possibility exists even today. He leafed through the book. Do you know, he asked, that Summers gave literally dozens of instances of lycanthropy, things that are positively known to have happened? I took another sip of whiskey and water. Those are only legends, Shirley. They are nothing of the sort. The judge's eyes protrude even more in the earnestness, and he tapped the pages with an excited forefinger. There are 4 excellent cases listed in this chapter on France alone, sworn to, tried and sentenced by courts. But weren't they during the Middle Ages, I suggested? He shook his great head. No, during the 16th century, the peak of the Renaissance. Oh, don't smile at the age, Mr. Wells. It produced Shakespeare, Bacon, Montaigne, Galileo, Leonardo, Martin Luther, Descartes, and Spinoza were its legitimate children, and Voltaire built upon it. Yet werewolves were known, seen, convicted. Convicted? On what grounds? I interrupted quickly, for I was beginning to reflect his warmth. For answer, he turned some pages. Here's a full account of the case of Peter Stump, he said. A contemporary record telling of Stump's career in and out of wolf form, his capture in the very act of shifting shape, his confession and execution, all near Cologne, in the year 1589. Listen. He read aloud. Witnesses that this is true. Thijs Artin, William Brewer, Adolf State, George Bors, with divers others that have seen the same. Slamming the book shut, he looked up at me, the twinkle coming back into those speckled eyes. Well, Mr. Wills, how do those names sound to you? Why, like the names of honest German citizens. Exactly. Honest, respectable, solid. And their testimony is hard to pass off with a laugh, even at this distance in time, right? He had almost made me see those witnesses, leather-jerkined and broad-breeched, with heavy jaws and squinting eyes, taking their turn at the quill pen with which they set their names to that bizarre document. With divers others they have seen the same, perhaps too frightened to hold pen or make signature. Still, I said slowly, Germany of the Renaissance, the 16th century, and there have been so many changes since. Werewolves have gone out of fashion, you mean? You admit that they might have existed. He fairly beamed his triumph. So have beards gone out of fashion? But they will sprout again if we lay down our razors. Let's go at it another way. Let's talk about materialization, ectoplasm for the moment." He relaxed, and across his great girth his fingers sought one another. "Suppose you explain briefly and simply what ectoplasm is considered to be." I was turning towards the back of Richet's book. "It's in here, Judge Purvisant. To be brief and simple, as you say, certain mediums apparently exude an unclassified material called ectoplasm. This, at first light and vaporescent, becomes firm and takes shape, either upon the body of the medium or as a separate and living creature." "And you don't believe in this phenomenon?" he prompted, with something of insistence. "I have never said that I didn't," I replied truthfully, "but even before my experience of this evening went so far toward convincing me, but with the examples I have seen, I felt that true scientific control was lacking. With all their science, most of the investigators trust too greatly." Judge Purvisant shook with gentle laughter. "They are doctors for the most part, and this honesty of theirs is a professional failing that makes them look for it in others. You, begging your pardon, are a magician, a professional deceiver, and you expect trickery in all whom you meet. Perhaps a good lawyer with trial experience, with a level head, and a sense of competent material evidence for both sides, should attend these seances, right?" "You're quite right," I said heartily. "But returning to the subject, what else can be said about ectoplasm? That is, if it actually exists." I had found in Richet's book the passage for which I had been searching. "It says here that bits of ectoplasm have been secured in rare instances, and that some of these have been examined microscopically. There were traces of fatty tissue, bacterial forms, and epithelium." "Ah, those were the findings of Schrenck-Notzing. A sound man and a brilliant one, hard to corrupt or fool. It makes ectoplasm sound organic, does it not?" I nodded agreement, and my hand felt heavy, as if full or sober in important matters. "As for me," I went on, "I never have had much chance to examine the stuff. Whether I get hold of an ectoplasmic hand, it melts like butter." "They generally do," the judge commented, "or so the reports say, yet they themselves are firm and strong when they touch or seize." "Right, sir." "It's when attacked, or even frightened, as with a camera flashlight, that the ectoplasm vanishes or is reabsorbed," he prompted further. "So Richet says here," I agreed once more, "and so I have found." "Very good. Now," and his manner took on a flavor legal, "I shall sum up. Ectoplasm is put forth by certain spirit mediums who are mysteriously adapted for it, under favorable conditions that include darkness, quiet self-confidence. It takes form, altering the appearance of the medium or making up a separate body. It is firm and strong, but vanishes when attacked or frightened. Right so far?" "Right," I agreed. "Now, for the word medium, substitute wizard." His grin burst out again, and he began to mix a third round of drinks. "A wizard, having darkness and quiet and being disposed to change shape, exudes a material that gives him a new shape and character. Maybe it is bestial, to match a fierce or desperate spirit within. There may be a shaggy pelt, a sharp muzzle, taloned paws and rending fangs. To a terrified victim, he is doom itself. But to a brave adversary, facing and fighting him—" He flipped his way through Summer's book, as I had with Richet's. "Listen. The shape of the werewolf will be removed if he be reproached by name as a werewolf, or if again he be thrice addressed by his Christian name, or struck 3 blows on the forehead with a knife, or that 3 drops of blood should be drawn. Do you see the parallels, man? Shouted at, bravely denounced, or slightly wounded, his false beast substance fades from him." He flung out his hands as though appealing to a jury. "I marvel nobody ever thought of it before." "But nothing so contrary to nature has a natural explanation," I objected. And very idiotic the phrase sounded in my own ears. He laughed, and I could not blame him. "I'll confound you with another of your own recent experiences. What could seem more contrary to nature than the warmth and greenness of the middle of Devil's Croft? And what is more simply natural than the hot springs that make it possible? Yet an envelope of bestiality, Beast muzzle on human face, beast paws on human hands. I can support that by more werewolf lore. I don't even have to open Summers. Everyone has heard the story. A wolf attacks a traveler, who with his sword lops off a paw. The beast howls and flees, and the paw it leaves behind is a human hand. That's an old one in every language. Probably because it happens so often. There's your human hand, with the beast paw forming upon and around it, then vanishing like wounded ectoplasm. Where's the weak point, Wills? Name it, I challenge you. I felt the glass shake in my hand, and a chilly wind brushed my spine. There's one point, I made myself say. You may think it is a slender one, even a quibble, but ectoplasms make human forms, not animal. How do you know they don't make animal forms? Judge Purvisant crowed, leaning forward across the desk. Because of the few you've seen and disbelieved? Only human faces and bodies showed? My reply is there in your hands. Open Richet's book to page 545, Mr. Wills. Page 545. Got it? Now the passage I marked about the medium Bergeek. Read it aloud. He sank back into his chair once more, waiting in manifest delight. I found the place underscored with pencil, and my voice was hoarse as I obediently read. My trouser leg was strongly pulled, and a strange, ill-defined form that seemed to have paws like those of a dog or a small monkey climbed on my knee. I could feel its weight, very light, and something like the muzzle of an animal touched my cheek. There you are, Wills, Judge Purvisant was crying. Notice that it happened in Warsaw, close to the heart of the werewolf country. Reading that passage makes you sweat a bit, remembering what you saw in the Devil's Croft. I flung down the book. You've done much toward convincing me, I admitted. I'd rather have the superstitious peasant's belief, though, the one I've always scoffed at. Rationalizing the business didn't help then. It did when I explained the Devil's Croft and the springs. But the springs don't chase you with sharp teeth, and, as I was saying, the peasant had a protection that the scientist lacks. Trust in his crucifix and his Bible. Why shouldn't he have that trust, and why shouldn't you? Again the judge was rummaging in his bookcase. Those symbols of faith gave him what is needed, a strong heart to drive back the menace, whether it be wolf demon or ectoplasmic bogey. Here, my friend. He laid a third book on the desk. It was a Bible, red edge and leather-backed, worn from much use. Have a read at that while you finish your drink, he advised me. The Gospel according to St. John is good, and it's already marked. Play you're a peasant, hunting for comfort. Like a dutiful child, I opened the Bible to where a faded purple ribbon lay between the pages, but already Judge Purvisant was quoting from memory. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. It may seem incredible that later in the night I slept like a dead pig, yet I had reason. First of all, there was the weariness that had followed my dangers and exertions. Then Judge Purvisant's whiskey and logic combined to reassure me. Finally, the leather couch in his study, its surface comfortably hollowed by much reclining thereupon, was a sedative in itself. He gave me 2 quilts, very warm and very light, and left me alone. I did not stir until a rattle of breakfast dishes awakened me. William, the judge's servant, had carefully brushed my clothes. My shoes also showed free of mud, though they still felt damp and clammy. The judge himself furnished me with a clean shirt and socks, both items very loose upon me, and lent me his razor. Some friends of yours called during the night, he told me dryly. Friends? Yes, from the town. 5 of them with ropes and guns. They announced very definitely that they intended to decorate the flagpole in the public square with your corpse. There was also some informal talk about drinking your blood. We may have vampires as well as werewolves hereabouts. I almost cut my lip with a razor. How did you get rid of them? I asked quickly. They must have followed my tracks. Lucky there was more snow after we got in, he replied. And they came here only as a routine checkup. They must have visited every house within miles. Oh, turning them away was easy. I feigned wild enthusiasm for the manhunt and asked if I couldn't come along. He smiled reminiscently, his mustache stirring like a rather genial blonde snake. Then what? I prompted him. dabbing on more lather. Why, they were delighted. I took a rifle and spent a few hours on the trail. You weren't to be found at all, so we returned to town. Excitement reigns there, you can believe. What kind of excitement? Bloodlust and compassion. Since Constable O'Brien is wounded, his younger brother, a strong advocate of your immediate capture and execution, is serving as a volunteer guardian of the peace. He's acting on an old appointment by his brother as deputy, to serve without pay. He told the council, a badly scared group, that he has sent for help to the county seat, but I am sure he did nothing of the kind. Meanwhile, the Croft is surrounded by scouts who hope to catch you sneaking out of it, and the women of the town are looking after Susan Gerd and your friend, the Herr Doctor. I had finished shaving. How is Dr. Zoberg? I inquired through the towel. Still pretty badly shaken up. I tried to get in and see him, but it was impossible. I understand he went out for a while early in the evening, but almost collapsed. Just now he's completely surrounded by cooing old ladies with soup and herb tea. Miss Gerd was feeling much better and talked to me for a while. I am not really on warm terms with the town, you know. People think it's indecent for me to live out here alone and not give them a chance to gossip about me. So I was pleasurably surprised to get a kind word from Miss Susan. She told me very softly, for fear someone might overhear, that she hopes you aren't caught. She is sure that you did not kill her father. We went into his dining room, where William offered pancakes, fried bacon, and the strongest black coffee I ever tasted. In the midst of it all, I put down my fork and faced the judge suddenly. He grinned above his cup. Well, Mr. Wills, stung by the splendor of a sudden thought, all you need is a sensitive hand clasped to your inspired brow. You said, I reminded him, that Susan Gerd is sure that I didn't kill her father? So I did. She told you that herself? She also seemed calm, self-contained, instead of in mourning for... Oh, come. He paused to shift a full half-dozen cakes to his plate and skillfully drenched them with syrup. That's rather ungrateful of you, Mr. Wills, suspecting her of parricide. Did I say that? I protested, feeling my ears turn bright red. You would have if I hadn't broken your sentence in the middle, he accused, and put a generous portion of pancake into his mouth. As he chewed, he twinkled at me through his pince-nez, and I felt uncomfortably foolish. If Susan Gerd had truly killed her father, he resumed, after swallowing, she would be more adroitly theatrical. She would weep, swear vengeance on his murderer, and be glad to hear that someone else had been accused of the crime. She would even invent details to help incriminate that someone else. Perhaps she doesn't know that she killed him, I offered. Perhaps not. You mean that a new mind, as well as a new body, may invest the werewolf or ectoplasmic medium at time of change? I jerked my head in agreement. Then Susan Gerd, as she is normally, must be innocent. Come, Mr. Wills, would you blame poor old Dr. Jekyll for the crime of his alter ego, Mr. Hyde? I wouldn't want to live in the same house with Dr. Jekyll. Judge Purvisant burst into a roar of laughter, at which William, bringing fresh supplies from the kitchen, almost dropped his tray. So romance enters the field of psychic research, the judge crowed at me. I stiffened, outraged. Judge Purvisant, I certainly did not. I know you didn't say it. But again, I anticipated you. So it's not the thought of her possible unconscious crime, but the chance of comfortable companionship that perplexes you. He stopped, laughing suddenly. I'm sorry, Wills. Forgive me. I shouldn't laugh at this, or indeed at any aspect of the whole very serious business. I could hardly take real offense at the man who had rescued and sheltered me, and I said so. We finished breakfast, and he sought his overcoat and white hat. I'm off for town again, he announced. There are 1 or 2 points to be settled there, for your safety and my satisfaction. Do you mind being left alone? There's an interesting lot of books in my study. You might like to look at a copy of Dom Calmet's Dissertations. If you read French, also rather slovenly Wicked Bible, signed by Pierre de Lamprey. J.W. Wickwar, the witchcraft authority, thinks that such a thing does not exist. But I know of 2 others. Or if you feel that you're having enough of demonology in real life, you will find a whole row of light novels, including most of P.G. Wodehouse. He held out his hand in farewell. William will get you anything you want. There's tobacco and a choice of pipes on my desk. Whiskey, too, though you don't look like the sort that drinks before noon." With that he was gone, and I watched him from the window. He moved sturdily across the bright snow to a shed, slid open its door and entered. Soon there emerged a sedan, old but well kept, with a judge at the wheel. He drove away down a snow-filled road toward town. I did not know what to envy most in him, his learning, his assurance, or his good nature. The assurance I decided once, then it occurred to me that he was in nothing like the awkward position I held. He was only a sympathetic ally. But why was he that even? I tried to analyze his motives and could not. Sitting down in his study, I saw on the desk the Montague Summers book on werewolves. It lay open at page 111, and my eyes lighted at once upon a passage underscored in ink, apparently some time ago, for the mark was beginning to rust a trifle. It included a quotation from Restitution of Decayed Intelligence, written by Richard Rowlands in 1605. "Werewolves are certain sorcerers who haven't anointed their bodies with an ointment which they make by the instinct of the devil, and putting on a certain enchanted girdle do not only unto the view of others seem as wolves, but to their own thinking have both the shape and the nature of wolves, so long as they wear the said girdle, and they do dispose themselves as very wolves, and worrying and killing, and most of human creatures." This came to the bottom of the page, where someone, undoubtedly Purveson, had written, "Ointment and girdle sound as if they might have a scientific explanation," and the same script, but smaller, the following notes filled the margin besides: "Possible werewolf motivations. 1. Involuntary lycanthropy. Must have blood to drink, connection with vampirism. Must have secrecy, driven to desperation by contemplating horror of own position. Number 2, voluntary lycanthropy. Will to do evil, will to exert power through fear. 3, contributing factors to becoming werewolf. Loneliness and dissatisfaction, hunger for forbidden foods, human flesh, etc., scorn and hate of fellow men, general or specific, occult curiosity, Simon pure insanity, Satanist complex. Are any or all of these traits to be found in werewolf? Find one and ask it." That was quite enough lycanthropy for the present, so far as I was concerned. I drew a book of Mark Twain from the shelf. I seemed to remember it as Tom Sawyer Abroad. I read it all the morning. Noon came, and I was about to ask the judge's servant for some lunch when he appeared in the door of the study. "Someone with a message," he announced, and drew aside to admit Susan Gurd. I fairly sprang to my feet, dropping my book upon the desk. She advanced slowly into the room, her pale face grave but friendly. I saw that her eyes were darkly circled, and that her cheeks showed gaunt, as if with strain and weariness. She put out a hand, and I took it. "A message?" I repeated William's words. "Why, yes." She achieved a smile, and I was glad to see it, for both our sakes. "Judge Purveson got me to one side and said for me to come here. You and I are to talk the things over." "You mean last night?" She nodded, and I asked further, "How did you get here?" "Your car. I don't drive very well, but I managed." I asked her to sit down and talk. She told me that she remembered being in the parlor with Constable O'Brien, questioning me. At the time she had a difficulty remembering even the beginning of the seance, and it was not until I had been taken away that she came to realize what had happened to her father. That, of course, distressed and distracted her further, and even now the whole experience was wretchedly hazy to her. "I do recall sitting down with you," she said finally, after I had urged her for the 20th time to think hard. "You changed me, yes, and Dr. Zoberg, then yourself. Finally I seemed to float away as if in a dream. I'm not even sure about how long it was." "Had the light been out for very long?" I asked craftily. "The light out?" She echoed, patently mystified. "Oh, of course, the light was turned out naturally. I don't remember, but I suppose you attended to that?" "I asked to try you," I confessed. "I didn't touch the lamp until after you had seemed to drop off to sleep." She did recall to memory her father's protest at his manacles and Dr. Zoberg's gentle inquiry if she were ready. That was all. "How is Dr. Zoberg?" I asked her. "Not very well, I'm afraid. He was exhausted by the experience, of course, and for a time seemed ready to break down. When the trouble began about you, the crowd gathered at the town hall. He gathered his strength and went out to see if he could help defend or rescue you. He was gone about an hour, and then he returned bruised about the face. Somebody of the mob had handled him roughly, I think. He's resting at our place now, with a hot compress on his eye." "Good man," I applauded. "At least he did his best for me." She was not finding much pleasure in her memories, however, and I suggested a change of the subject. We had lunch together, egg sandwiches and coffee, then played several hands of casino. Tiring of that, we turned to the books, and she read aloud to me from Keats. Never has the Eve of St. Agnes sounded better to me. Evening fell, and we were preparing to take yet another meal, a meat pie, which William assured us was one of his culinary triumphs, when the door burst open and Judge Purvisant came in. "You've been together all the time?" he asked us at once. "Why, yes," I said. "Is that correct, Miss Susan? You've been in the house every minute?" "That is right," she seconded me. "Then," said the judge, "you two are cleared, at last." He paused, looking from Susan's questioning face to mine, then went on. "That rending beast thing in the Croft got another victim, not more than half an hour ago. O'Brien was feeling better, ready to get back on duty. His deputy brother, anxious to get hold of Wills first, for glory or vengeance, ventured into the place just at dusk. He came out in a little while, torn and bitten almost to pieces, and died as he broke clear of the cedar hedge." I think both Susan and I fairly reeled before this news, like actors registering surprise in an old-fashioned melodrama. As for Judge Purvisant, he turned to the table, cut a generous wedge of the meat pie, and set it all savory and steaming on a plate for himself. His calm zest for the good food gave us other steadiness again, so that we sat down and even ate a little, as he described his day in town. He had found opportunity to talk to Susan in private, confiding to her about me and finally sending her to me. This, as he said, so that we would convince each other of our respective innocence. It was purely an inspiration, for he had had no idea, of course, that such conviction would turn out so final. Thereafter, he made shift to enter the Gerd house and talk to Dr. Zoberg. That worthy he found sitting somewhat limply in the parlor, with John Gerd's coffin in the next room. Zoberg, the judge reported, was mystified about the murder, and anxious to bring to justice the townsfolk. There was more than one, it seemed, who had beaten him. Most of all, however, he was concerned about the charges against me. "His greatest anxiety is to prove you innocent," Judge Purvisant informed me. "He intends to bring the best lawyer possible for your defense, is willing even to assist in paying the fee. He also swears that character witnesses can be brought to testify that you are the most peaceable and law-abiding man in the country." "That's mighty decent of him," I said. "According to your reasoning of this morning, his attitude proves him innocent, too." "What reasoning was that?" asked Susan, and I was glad that the judge continued without answering her. "I was glad that I had sent Miss Susan on. If your car had remained there, Mr. Wills, Dr. Zoberg might have driven off in it to rally your defenses." "Not if I know him," I objected. "The whole business, what of the mystery and occult significance, will hold him right on the spot. He's relentlessly curious, and despite his temporary collapse, he is no coward." "I agree with that," chimed in Susan. "As for my pursuers of the previous night," the judge went on, "they have been roaming the snow-covered streets in twos and threes, heavily armed for the most part, and still determined to punish me for killing their neighbor. The counsel was too frightened or too perplexed to deal with the situation, and the constable was still in bed with his brother, assuming authority, when Judge Purvisant made his inquiries. The judge went to see the wounded man, who very pluckily determined to rise and take up his duties again. 'I'll arrest the man who plugged me, O'Brien,' had promised grimly, "and that kid brother of mine can quit playing policeman." The judge applauded these sentiments, and brought him hot food and whiskey, which further braced his spirits. In the evening came the invasion by the younger O'Brien of the Devil's Croft, and his resultant death at the claws and teeth of what prowled there. His throat was so torn open and filled with blood that he could not speak, the judge concluded. But he pointed back into the timber and then tried to trace something in the snow with his finger. It looked like a wolf's head, with pointed nose and ears. He died before he finished. "You saw him come out?" I asked. "No. I'd gone back to town, but later I saw the body and the sketch in the snow." He finished his dinner and pushed back his chair. "Now," he said heartily, "it's up to us." "Up to us to do what?" I inquired. "To meet that monster face to face," he replied. "There are 3 of us, and, as far as I can ascertain, but one of the enemy." Both Susan and I started to speak, but he held up his hand, smiling. "I know without being reminded that the odds are still against us, because the one enemy is fierce and blood-drinking and can change shape and character. Maybe it can project itself to a distance, which makes it all the harder both for us to face it and for us to get help." "I know what you mean by that last," I nodded gloomily. "If there were 10,000 friendly constables in the neighborhood instead of a single hostile one, they wouldn't believe us." "Right," agreed Judge Purvisant. "We're like the group of perplexed mortals in Dracula, who had only their own wits and weapons against a monster no more forbidding than ours." It is hard to show clearly how his constant offering of parallels and rationalizations comforted us. Only the unknown and unknowable can terrify completely. We 3 were even cheerful over a bottle of wine that William fetched and poured out in 3 glasses. Judge Purvisant gave us a toast. "May wolves go hungry," and Susan and I drank it gladly. "Don't forget what's on our side," said the judge, putting down the glass. "I mean the steadfast and courageous heart, of which I preached to Wills last night, and which we can summon from within us any time and anywhere. The werewolf, dauntlessly faced, loses its dread, and I think we are the ones to face it. Now we're ready for action." I said that I would welcome any kind of action whatsoever, and Susan touched my arm as if endorsement of the remark. Judge Purvisant's spectacles glittered in approval. "You 2 will go into the Devil's Croft," he announced. "I'm going back to town once more." "Into the Devil's Croft?" we almost shouted, both in the same shocked breath. "Of course. Didn't we just get through with the agreement all around that the lycanthrope can and must be met face to face? Offense is the best defense, as perhaps 100,000 athletic trainers have reiterated." "I've already faced the creature once," I reminded him. "As for appearing dauntless, I doubt my own powers of deceit." "You shall have a weapon," he said. "A fire gives light, and we know that such things must have darkness, such as it finds in the midst of that swampy wood. So fill your pockets with matches, both of you." "How about a gun?" I asked, but he shook his head. "We don't want the werewolf killed. That would leave the whole business in mystery, and yourself probably charged with another murder. He'd return to his human shape, you know, the moment he was hurt even slightly." Susan spoke very calmly. "I'm ready to go into the Croft, Judge Purvisant." He clapped his hands loudly, as if in applauding a theatre. "Bravo, my dear, bravo! I see Mr. Wills sets his jaw. That means he's ready to go with you. Very well, let us be off." He called to William, who at his orders brought 3 lanterns, sturdy old-fashioned affairs, protected by strong wire nettings, and filled them with oil. We each took one and set out. It had turned clear and frosty once more, and the moon shone too brightly for my comfort, at least. However, as we approached the grove, we saw no sentinels. They could hardly be blamed for deserting after the fate of the younger O'Brien. We gained the shadow of the outer cedars unchallenged. Here Judge Purvisant called a halt, produced a match from his overcoat pocket, and lighted our lanterns all around. I remember that we struck a fresh light for Susan's lantern. We agreed that, silly as the 3 on a match superstition might be, This was no time or place to tempt Providence. "Come on," said Judge Purvisant then, and led the way into the darkest part of the immense thicket. We followed Judge Purvisant, Susan and I, without much of a thought, beyond an understandable dislike for being left alone on the brink of the timber. It was a slight struggle to get through the close-set cedar hedge, especially for Susan, but beyond it we soon caught up with the judge. He strode heavily and confidently among the trees, his lantern held high to shed light upon broad, polished leaves and thick, wet stems. The moist warmth of the grove's interior made itself felt again, and the judge explained again and at greater length that hot springs that made possible this surprising condition. All the while he kept going. He seemed to know his way in that forbidden fastness. Indeed, he must have explored it many times to go straight to his destination. That destination was a clearing, in some degrees like the one where I had met and fought with my hairy pursuer on the night before. This place had, however, a great tree in its center, with branches that shot out in all directions to hide away the sky completely. By straining the ears one could catch a faint murmur of water. My scalding stream, no doubt. Around us were the thick-set trunks of the forest, filled in between with brush and vines, and underfoot grew velvety moss. "This will be our headquarters position," said the judge. "Wills, help me gather wood for a fire. Break dead branches from the standing trees. Never mind picking up wood from the ground. It will be too damp." Together we collected a considerable heap, and crumbling a bit of paper in its midst, he kindled it. "Now then," he went on, "I'm heading for town. You two will stay here and keep each other company." He took our lanterns, blew them out, and ran his left arm through the loops of their handles. "I'm sure that nothing will attack you in the light of the fire. You're bound to attract whatever skulks hereabouts. However, when I come back, we ought to be prepared to go into the final act of our little melodrama." He touched my hand, bowed to Susan, and went tramping away into the timber. The thick leafage blotted his lantern light from our view before his back had been turned 20 seconds. Susan and I gazed at each other and smiled rather uneasily. "It's warm," she breathed, and took off her cloak. Dropping it upon one of the humped roots of the great central tree, she sat down on it with her back to the trunk. "What kind of a tree is this?" I gazed up at the gnarled stem, or as much of it as I could see in the firelight. Finally I shook my head. "I don't know. I'm no expert," I admitted. "At least, it's very big and undoubtedly very old. The sort of tree that used to make a place of sacrifice." At the word sacrifice, Susan lifted her shoulders as if in distaste. "You're right, Talbot. It would be something grim and druid-like." She began to recite half to herself. "The tree in whose dark shadows the ghastly priest doth reign, the priest who slew the slayer, and shall himself be slain." "Macaulay," I said at once. Then, to get her mind off of morbid things, I had to recite the lays of ancient Rome in school when I was a boy. I wish you hadn't mentioned it." "You mean because it's an evil omen?" She shook her head and contrived a smile that lighted up her pale face. "It's not that, if you analyze it. Shall himself be slain? It sounds as if the enemy's fate is sealed." I nodded, then spun around sharply, for I fancied I heard a dull crashing at the edge of the clearing. Then I went here and there, gathering wood enough to keep our fire burning for some time. One branch, a thick straight one, I chose from the heap and leaned against the big tree, within easy reach of my hand. "That's for a club," I told Susan, and she half shrunk, half stiffened at the implication. We fell to talking about Judge Purvisant, the charm and the enigma that invested him. Both of us felt gratitude that he had immediately clarified our own innocence in the grisly slayings, but to both came a sudden inspiration, distasteful and disquieting. I spoke first. "Susan, why did the judge bring us here?" "He said to help face and defeat the monster, but... Who is that monster?" I demanded. What human being puts on a semi-bestial appearance to rend and kill? You don't mean the judge? As I say it, it had been in both our minds. We were silent and felt shame and embarrassment. Look here, I went on earnestly after a moment. Perhaps we're being ungrateful, but we mustn't be unprepared. Think, Susan, nobody knows where Judge Purvisant was at the time of your father's death. At the time I saw the thing in these woods. I broke off, remembering how I had met the judge for the first time so shortly after my desperate struggle with the pointed-ear demon. Nobody knows where he was when the constable's brother was attacked and mortally wounded. She gazed about fearfully. Nobody, she added breathlessly, knows where he is now. I was remembering a conversation with him. He had spoken of books, mentioning a supposedly non-existent volume. What was it? The Wicked Bible. And what was it I had once heard about that work? It came back to me now, out of the subconscious brain chamber, where apparently one stores everything he hears or reads in idleness, and from which such items creep on occasion. It had been in Louis Spence's Encyclopedia of Occultism, now on the shelf in my New York apartment. The Wicked Bible, scriptures for witches and wizards, from which magic mongers of the Dark Ages drew their inspirations and their knowledge, and Judge Purvisant had admitted to having one. What had he learned from it? How had he been so glib about the science, yes, and the psychology of being a werewolf? If what we suspect is true, I said to Susan, we are here at his mercy. Nobody is going to come in here, not if horses drag them. At his leisure he will fall upon us and tear us to pieces. But even as I spoke, I despised myself for my weak fears in her presence. I picked up my club and was comforted by its weight and thickness. I met that devil once, I said, studying cheer and confidence into my voice this time. I don't think it relished the meeting any too much. Next time won't be any more profitable for it. She smiled at me as if in encouragement. Then we both started and fell silent. There had risen somewhere among the thickets a long, low whining. I put out a foot stealthily as though fearful of being caught in motion. A quick kick flung more wood on the fire. I blinked in the light and felt the heat. Standing there as a primitive man might have stood in the flame-guarded camp to face the horrors of the ancient world, I tried to judge by either direction of that whine. It died, and I heard perhaps in my imagination a stealthy padding. Then the whining began again from a new quarter and nearer. I made myself step toward it. My shadow leaping grotesquely among the tree trunks almost frightened me out of my wits. The whine had changed into a crooning wail, such as that with which dogs salute the full moon. It seemed to plead, to promise, and it was coming closer to the clearing. Once before I had challenged and taunted the thing with scornful words. Now I could not make my lips form a single syllable. Probably it was just as well, for I thought and watched the more. Something black and cautious was moving among the branches, just beyond the shrubbery that screened it from our firelight. I knew, without need of a clear view, what that black something was. I lifted my club to the ready. The sound it made had become, in some fashion, articulate, though not human in any quality. There were no words to it, but it spoke to the heart. The note of plea and promise had become one of command, and not directed to me. I found my own voice. "Get out of here, you devil!" I roared at it, and threw my club. Even as I let go of it, I wished I had not. The bushes foiled my aim, and the missile collided among them and dropped to the mossy ground. The creature fell craftily silent. Then I felt sudden panic and regret at being left weaponless, and I retreated toward the fire. "Susan," I said huskily, "give me another stick, hurry." She did not move or stir, and I rummaged frantically among the heaped dried branches for myself. Catching up the first piece of wood that would serve, I turned to her with worried curiosity. She was still seated upon the cloak-draped root, but she had drawn herself tense like a cat before a mouse-hole. Her head was thrust forward so far that her neck extended almost horizontally. Her dilated eyes were turned in the direction from which the whining and crooning had come. They had a strange clarity in them, as if they could pierce the twigs and leaves and meet there to answering, understanding gaze. "Susan!" I cried. Still she gave no sign that she had heard me. If hear me she did. She leaned further forward, as if ready to spring up and run. Once more the unbeastly wail rose from the place where our watcher was lurking. Susan's lips trembled. From them came slowly and softly, then louder, a long, answering howl. The stick almost fell from my hands. She rose slowly but confidently. Her shoulders hunched high, her arms hung forward as though they wanted to reach to the ground. Again she howled, "Oh!" I saw that she was going to move across the clearing, toward the trees, through the trees. My heart seemed to twist into a knot inside me, but I could not let her do such a thing. I made a quick stride and planted myself before her. "Susan, you mustn't!" She shrank back, her face turning slowly up to mine. Her back was to the fire, yet light rose in her eyes, or perhaps behind them. A green light, such as reflects and still force pulls from the moon. Her hands lifted suddenly as though to repel me. They were half closed, and the crooked fingers drawn stiff like talons. "Susan!" I coaxed her yet again, and she made no answer, but tried to slip sidewise around me. I moved and headed her off, and she growled, actually growled like a savage dog. With my free hand, I clutched her shoulder. Under my fingers her flesh was as taut as wire fabric. Then suddenly it relaxed into human tissue again, and she was standing straight. Her eyes had lost their weird light. They showed only dark and frightened. "Talbot," she stammered, what have I been doing?" "Nothing, my dear," I comforted her. "It was nothing that we weren't able to fight back." From the woods behind me came a throttling yelp, as of some hungry thing robbed of prey within its very grasp. Susan swayed, seemed about to drop, and I caught her quickly in my arms. Holding her thus, I turned my head and laughed over my shoulder. "Another score against you," I jeered at my enemy. "You didn't get her, not with all your filthy enchantments." Susan was beginning to cry, and I half led, half carried her back to the fireside. At my gesture, she sat on her cloak again, as tractable as a child who repents of rebellion and tries to be obedient. There were no more sounds from the timber. I could feel an emptiness there, as if the monster had slunk away, baffled. Neither of us said anything for a while after that. I stoked up the fire to be doing something, and it made us so uncomfortably warm that we had to crowd away from it. Sitting close against a tree trunk, I began to imagine something creeping up the black lane of shadows it cast behind us to the edge of the clearing, and yet again I thought I heard noises. Club in hand, I went to investigate, and I was not disappointed in the least when I found nothing. Finally Susan spoke. "This," she said, "is a new light on the thing." "It's nothing to be upset about," I tried to comfort her. "Not be upset?" She sat straight up, and in the light of the fire I could see a single pain line between her brows, deep and sharp as a chisel gash. "Not when I'm almost turned into a beast?" "How much of that do you remember?" I asked her. "I was foggy in my mind, Talbot, almost as at the seance, but I remember being drawn to what was waiting out there." Her eyes sought the thicket on the far side of our blaze. "And it didn't seem horrible, but pleasant and welcoming and, well, as if it were my kind. You," and she glanced quickly at me, then ashamedly away, "you were suddenly strange and to be avoided. Is that all?" "It spoke to me," she went on in husky horror, "and I spoke to it." I forbore to remind her that the only sound she had uttered was a wordless howl. Perhaps she did not know that. I hope not. We said no more for another awkward time. Finally she mumbled, "I'm not the kind of woman who cries easily, but I'd like to now." "Go ahead," I said at once, and she did, and I let her. Whether I took her into my arms or whether she came into them of her own accord, I do not remember exactly. but it was against my shoulder that she finished her weeping, and when she had finished, she did feel better. That somehow washed the fog and the fear out of me, she confessed, almost brightly. It must have been a full hour later that rustlings rose yet again in the timber. So frequently had my imagination tricked me that I did not so much as glance up. Then Susan gave a little startled cry, and I sprang to my feet. Beyond the fire, a tall grey shape had become visible, with a pale glare of light around it. "Don't be alarmed," called a voice I knew. "It is I, Otto Zoberg." "Doctor," I cried, and hurried to meet him. For the first time in our life I felt that he was a friend. Our differences of opinion, once making companionship strained, had so dwindled to nothing in comparison to the danger I faced, and his avowed trust in me as innocent of murder. "How are you?" I said, wringing his hand. "They say you were hurt by the mob." "Ah, it was nothing serious," he reassured me. "Only this." He touched with his forefinger an eye, and I could see it was bruised and swollen, half shut. "A citizen with too ready a fist and too slow a mind has had that to answer for." "I'm partly responsible," I said. "You were trying to help me. I understand when it happened." More noise behind him, and two more shapes pushed into the clearing. I recognized Judge Purvisant, nodding to me with his eyes bright under his wide hat brim. The other man, angular, falcon-faced, one arm in a sling, I had also seen before. It was Constable O'Brien. I spoke to him, but he gazed past me, apparently not hearing. Dr. Zoberg saw my perplexed frown, and he turned back toward the constable. Snapping long fingers in front of the great hook nose, he whistled shrilly. O'Brien started, grunted, then glared around as though he had been suddenly and rudely awakened. "What's up?" he growled menacingly, and his sound hand moved swiftly to a holster at his side. Then his eyes found me, and with an oath he drew his revolver. "Easy, constable, easy does it," soothed Judge Purvisant, his own great hand clutching O'Brien's wrist. "You've forgotten that I showed you how Mr. Wills must be innocent." "I've forgotten what we're here for at all," snapped O'Brien, gazing around the clearing. "Hey, have I been drunk or something? I said that I'd never—" "I'll explain," offered Zoberg. "The judge met me in town, and we came together to see you. Remember? You said you would like to avenge your brother's death, and came with us. Then, when you balked at the very edge of this devil's Croft, I took the liberty of hypnotizing you." "Huh? How did you do that?" growled the officer. "With a look, a word, a motion of the hand," said Zoberg, his eyes twinkling. "Then you ceased all objections and came in with us." Purvisant clapped O'Brien on the unwounded shoulder. "Sit down," he invited, motioning toward the roots of the trees. The five of us gathered round the fire, like picnickers instead of allies against a supernormal monster. There, at Susan's insistence, I told of what had happened since Judge Purvisant had left us. All listened with rapt attention, the constable grunting occasionally, the judge clicking his tongue, and Dr. Zoberg in absolute silence. It was Zoberg who made the first comment after I finished. "This explains many things," he said. "It don't explain a doggone thing," grumbled O'Brien. Zoberg smiled at him, then turned to Judge Purvisant. "Your ectoplasmic theory of lycanthropy, such as you have explained it to me, is most interesting and I think valid. May I advance it a trifle?" "In what way?" asked the judge. "Ectoplasm, as you see it, forms the werewolf by building upon the medium's body. But is not ectoplasm more apt, according to the observations of many people, to draw completely away and form a separate and complete thing of itself? The thing may be beastly, as you suggest. Algernon Blackwood, the English writer of psychic stories, almost hits upon it in one of his John Silence tales. He described an astral personality taking form and threatening harm while its physical body slept." "I know the story you mean," agreed Judge Purvisant. "The Camp of the Dog, I think it's called." "Very well, then. Perhaps while Miss Susan's body lay in a trance, securely handcuffed between Wills and myself—" "Oh," wailed Susan, "then it was I, after all?" "It couldn't have been you," I told her at once. "But it was. And while I was at the judge's home with you, part of me met the constable's brother in this wood. She stared wildly around her. It might as well have been part of me, I argued, and O'Brien glared at me as if in sudden support of that likelihood. But Susan shook her head. No, for which of us responded to the call of that thing out there? For the 100th time she gazed fearfully through the fire at the bushes behind which the commanding wine had risen. I have within me, she said dully, a nature that will break out, look and act like a beast demon, will kill even my beloved father. Please, interjected Judge Purvisant earnestly, you must not take responsibility upon yourself for what happened. If the ectoplasm engendered by you made up the form of the killer, the spirit may have come from without. How could it, she asked wretchedly, how could Marthe Barad exude ectoplasm that formed a bearded, masculine body? Purvisant looked across to Zoberg. Doctor, you surely know the famous Bienboa seance, and how the materialized entity spoke Arabic when the medium, a Frenchwoman, knew little or nothing of that language? Zoberg sat with his bearded chin on lean hands. His joined brows bristled the more as he corrugated his forehead and thought. We are each 1,000 personalities, he said, sententiously if not comfortingly. How can we rule them all, or rule even one of them? O'Brien said sourly that all this talk was too high-flown for him to understand or to enjoy. He dared hope, however, that the case could never be tied up to Miss Susan Gurd, whom he had known and liked since her babyhood. It can never do that, Zoberg said definitely. No court or jury could convict her on the evidence we are offering against her. I ventured an opinion. While you are attempting to show that Susan is a werewolf, you are forgetting that something else was prowling around our fire just out of sight. Ah, just out of sight, echoed Zoberg. That means you aren't sure what it was. Or even that there was anything, added Susan, so suddenly and strongly that I at least jumped. There was something, all right, I insisted. I heard it. You thought you heard a sound behind the tree, Susan reminded me. You looked, and there was nothing. Everyone gazed at me, rather like staid adults at a naughty child. I said, ungraciously, that my imagination was no better than theirs, and that I was no easier to frighten. Judge Purvisant suggested that we make a search of the surrounding woods for possible clues. A good idea, approved Constable O'Brien. The ground's damp. We might find some type of footprints. Then you stay here with Miss Susan, the judge said to him. We others will circle around. The gaunt constable shook his head. Not much, mister. I'm in on whatever searching is done. I've got something to settle with whatever killed my kid brother. But there are only 3 lanterns, pointed out Judge Purvisant. We have to carry them. Light's our best weapon. Zoberg then spoke up rather diffidently to say that he would be glad to stay with Susan. This was agreed upon, and the other 3 of us prepared for the search. I took the lantern from Zoberg's hand, nodded to the others, and walked away among the trees. Deliberately, I had turned my face towards the section beyond the fire, for, as I have said repeatedly, it was there that I had felt and heard the movements and cries of the being that had so strongly moved and bewitched Susan. My heart whispered rather loudly that I must look for myself at its traces or lack of them, or forever view myself with scorn. Almost at once I found tracks, the booted tracks of my 3 allies. Shaking my lantern to make it flare higher, I went deeper among the clumps, my eyes quartering the damp earth. After a few moments I found what I had come to look for. The marks were round and rather vague as to toe positions, yet not so clear-cut as to be made by hoofs. Rather they suggested a malformed stump or a palm with no fingers, and they were deep enough to denote considerable weight. The tracks of my own shoes next to them were rather shallower. I bent for a close look, then straightened up, looked everywhere at once, and held my torch above my head to shed light all around, for I had suddenly felt eyes upon me. I caught just a glimpse as of 2 points of light fading away into some leafage and in the direction of the clearing, and toward them I made my way, but there was nothing there, and the only tracks underfoot were of shod human beings, myself or one of the others. I returned to my outward search, following the round tracks. They were plainly of only 2 feet. There were no double impressions, like those of a quadruped, but I must have stalked along them for 10 minutes when I realized that I had no way of telling whether they went forward or backward. I might be going away from my enemy instead of toward it. A close examination did me little good, and I further pondered that the creature would lurk near the clearing, not go so straight away. Thus arguing within myself, I doubled back. Coming again close to the starting point, I thought of a quick visit to the clearing and a comforting word or two with Susan and Zoberg. Surely I was almost there, but why did not the fire gleam through the trees? Were they out of wood? Perplexed, I quickened my pace. A gnarled tree grew in my path, its low branches heavily bearded with vines. Beyond this rose only the faintest of glows. I paused to push aside some strands and peer. The fire had almost died, and by its light I but half saw two figures, one tall and one slender, standing together well to one side. They faced each other, and the taller, a seeming statue of wet-looking gray, held its companion by a shoulder. The other gray hand was stroking the smaller one's hands, pouring grayness thereon. I saw only this much, without stopping to judge or to wonder. Then I yelled and sprang into the clearing. At my outcry, the two fell apart and faced me. The smallest was Susan, who took a step in my direction, gave a little smothered whimper, as though she was trying to speak through a blanket. I ran to her side, and with a rough sweep of my sleeve, I cleared from her face and head a mass of slimy, shiny jelly. "You!" I challenged the other shape. "What have you been trying to do to her?" For only a breathing space it stood still, as featureless and clumsy as a half-formed figure of grey mud. Then darkness sprang out upon it, and hair. Eyes blazed at me, green and fearsome. A sharp muzzle opened to emit a snarl. "Now I know you," I hurled at it. "I'm going to kill you." And I charged. Claws ripped at my head, missed and tore the cloth of my coat. One of my arms shot around a lean, hairy middle with powerful muscles straining under its skin, and I drove my other fist for where I judged the pit of the stomach to be. Grappled, we fell and rolled over. The beast smell I remembered was all about us, and I knew the jaws were shoving once again at my throat. I jammed my forearm between them, so far into the hinge of them they could not close nor crush. My other hand clutched the skin of the throat. A great loose fistful drew it taut and began to twist with all my strength. I heard a half-broken yelp of strangled pain, felt a slackening of the body that struggled against me, knew that it was trying to get away. But I managed to roll on top, straddling the thing. "You're not so good on defense," I panted, and brought my other hand to the throat, for I had no idea save to kill. Paws grasped and tore at my wrists. There was shouting at my back, in Susan's voice and several others. Hands caught me by the shoulders and tried to pull me up and away. "No," I cried, "this is it. The werewolf." "It's Dr. Zoberg, you idiot," growled O'Brien in my ear. "Come on, let him up." "Yes," added Judge Purvisant, "it's Dr. Zoberg, as you say, but a moment ago it was the monster we have been hunting." I had been dragged upright by now, and so had Zoberg. He could only choke and glare, for the time being, his fingers to his half-crushed throat. Purvisant had moved within clutching distance of him, and was eyeing him as a cat eyes a mouse. "Like Wills, I only pretended to search, then doubled back to watch," went on the judge. "I saw Zoberg and Miss Susan talking. He spoke quietly, rhythmically, commandingly. She went into half a trance, and I knew she was hypnotized. As the fire died down, he began the change. Ectoplasm gushed out and over him. Before it took form, he began to smear some upon her. And Mr. Wills here came out of the woods and at him." O'Brien looked from the judge to Zoberg. Then he fumbled with his undamaged hand in a hip pocket, produced handcuffs, and stepped forward. The accused man grinned through his beard, as if admitting defeat in some trifling game. Then he held out his wrist with an air of resignation, and I, who had manacled them once, wondered again at their corded strength. The irons clicked shut upon one, then the other. "You know everything now," said Zoberg in a soft voice, but a steady one. I am a wolf. A wolf who hoped to mate with an angel." His bright eyes rested upon Susan, who shrank back. Judge Purvisant took a step toward the prisoner. "There is no need for you to insult her," he said. Zoberg grinned at him, with every long tooth agleam. "Do you want to hear my confession, or don't you?" Sure we want to hear it, grunted O'Brien. Leave him alone, Judge, and let him talk. He glanced at me. Got any paper, Mr. Wills? Somebody better take this down in writing. I produced a wad of notepaper and a stub pencil. Placing it upon my knee with a lantern for light, I scribbled almost word for word the tale that Dr. Zoberg told. Perhaps I was born what I am, he began. At least, even as a lad, I knew that there was a lust and a power for evil within me. Night called to me, when it frightens most children. I would slip out of my father's house and run for miles under the trees or across fields, with the moon for company. This was in Germany, of course, before the war. During the war, began Judge Purvisant. During the war, when most men were fighting, I was in prison. Again Zoberg grinned briefly and without cheer. I found it easy and inspiring to kill persons with a sense of added strength following, but they caught me and put me in what they call an asylum. I was supposed to be crazy. They confined me closely, but I, reading books in the library, grew to know what the change was that came upon me at certain intervals. I turned my attention to it, and became able to control the change, bringing it on or holding it off at will. He looked at Susan again. But I'm ahead of my story. Once, when I was at school, I met a girl, an American student of science and philosophy. She laughed at my wooing, but talked to me about spirits and psychic phenomena. That, my dear Susan, was your mother. When the end of the war brought so many new things, it also brought a different viewpoint toward many inmates of asylums. Some Viennese doctors, and later Sigmund Freud himself, found my case interesting. Of course, they did not arrive at the real truth, or they would not have procured my release. After that, I supplied writing swiftly. You became an expert psychic investigator and came to America. Yes, to find the girl who had once laughed and studied with me. After some years, I came to this town simply to trace the legend of this devil's Croft. And here I found she had lived and died and left behind a daughter that was her image. Judge Purvisant cleared his throat. I suspect that you're leaving out part of your adventures, Doctor? Zoberg actually laughed. Ja, I thought to spare you a few shocks, but if you will have them, you may. I visited Russia, and in 1922, a medical commission of the Soviet Union investigated several score mysterious cases of peasants killed and eaten. He licked his lips like a cat who thinks of meat. In Paris, I founded and conducted a rather interesting night school for the study of diabolism and its relationship to science. And in 1936, certain summer vacationists on Long Island were almost frightened out of their wits by a lurking thing that seemed half beast, half man. He chuckled. Your literary digest made much of it. The lurking thing was, of course, myself. We stared. Say, why do you do these things? The constable blurted. Zoberg turned to him, head quizzically aslant. Why do you uphold your local law? Or why does Judge Purvisant study ancient philosophies? Or why do Wills and Susan turn soft eyes upon each other? Because the heart of each so insists. Susan was clutching my arm. Her fingers bit into my flesh as Zoberg's eyes sought her again. I found the daughter of someone I once loved, he went on, with real gentleness in his voice. Wills, at least, can see in her what I saw. A new inspiration came to me, a wish and a plan to have a comrade in my secret exploits. A beast thing like yourself? Prompted the judge. Zoberg nodded. A lupa to my lupus, but this girl, Susan Gerd, had not inherited the psychic possibilities of her mother. What? I shouted. You yourself said that she was the greatest medium of all time. I did say so, but it was a lie. Why, in heaven's name? It was my hope, he broke in quietly, to make of her a medium or a lycanthrope. Call the phenomenon what you will. Are you interested in my proposed method? He gazed mockingly around, and his eyes rested finally upon me. Make full notes, Wills. This will be interesting, if not stupefying, to the psychic research committees. It is, as you know, a supernormal substance that is exuded to change the appearance of my body. What, I wondered, would some of that substance do if it was smeared upon her? I started to growl out a curse upon him, but Judge Purvisant rapped motion for me to keep silent. Think back through all the demonologies you have read, Zoberg was urging. What are the strange witch ointments that spread over an ordinary human body, gave it beast form and beast heart? There again, legend has basis in scientific fact. By the thunder, your logical, muttered Judge Purvisant. And damnable, I added. Go on, doctor. You were going to smear the change stuff upon Susan? But first, I knew I must convince her that she had within her the essence of a wolf, and so the seances. She was no medium, I said again. I made her think she was. I hypnotized her myself, did weird wonders in the dark room, but she in a trance did not know. I needed witnesses to convince her. So you invited Mr. Wills, supplied Judge Purvisant. Yes, and her father. They had been prepared to accept her as medium and me as observer. Seeing a beast form, they would tell her afterward that it was she. Zoberg, I said between set teeth, you're convicted out of your own mouth of rottenness that convinces me of the existence of the devil, after whom this grove was named. I wish to heaven that I'd kill you when we were fighting. Ah, Wills, he chuckled, you'd have missed the most entertaining autobiographical lecture. He's right, grumbled O'Brien. And let him go on, the judge pleaded with me. Once sure of this power within her, Zoberg said deeply, she would be prepared in heart and soul to change at touch of the ointment, the ectoplasm. Then to me she must turn as a fellow creature, together, throughout the world, adventuring in a way unbelievable. His voice died, and we let it. He stood in the firelight, head thrown back, manacled, hands folded. He might have been a martyr instead of a fiend, for whom a death at the stake would be too easy. I can tell what spoiled the seance, I told him after a moment. Gerd, sitting opposite, saw that it was you, not Susan, who had changed. You had to kill him, to keep him from telling there and then. Yes, agreed Zoberg. After that, you were arrested and later threatened. I was in an awkward position. Susan must believe herself, not you, guilty. That is why I have championed you throughout. I went then to look for you. And attacked me, I added. The beast self was ascendant. I cannot always control it completely. He sighed. When Susan disappeared, I went to look for her on the second evening. When I came into this wood, the change took place. Half automatically. Associations, I suppose. Constable, your brother happened upon me in an evil hour. Yup, said Brian gruffly. And that is the end, Zoberg said. The end of the story, and I suppose the end of me. You bet it is, the constable assured him. You came with a judge to finish your rotten work, but we're finishing it for you. One moment, interjected Judge Purvisant, and his firelit face betrayed a perplexed frown. The story fails to explain the one important thing. Does it, Zo? Prompted Zoberg, inclining toward him with a show of negligent grace. If you were able to free yourself and kill Mr. Gerd. By heaven, that's right, I broke in. You were chained, Zoberg, to Susan and to your chair. I'd go bail for the strength and tightness of those handcuffs. He grinned at each of us in turn and held out his hands with their manacles. Is it not obvious? He inquired. We looked at him a trifle blankly, I suppose, for he chuckled once again. Another employment of the ectoplasm, that useful substance of change, he said gently. At will my arms and legs assume thickness and hold the rings of the confining irons wide. Then, when I wish, they grow slender again, and... He gave his hands a sudden flirt, and the bracelets fell from them on the instant. He pivoted and ran like a deer. Shoot! Cried the judge, and O'Brien whipped his big gun from his shoulder. Zoberg was almost within a vine-laced clump of bushes when O'Brien fired. I heard a shrill scream and saw Zoberg falter and drop to his hands and knees. We were all starting forward. I paused a moment to put Susan behind me, and in that moment O'Brien and Purvisant sprang ahead and came up on either side of Zoberg. He was still alive, for he writhed up to a kneeling position and made a frantic clutch at the judge's throat. O'Brien, so close that he barely raised his hand and arm, fired a second time. Zoberg spun around somehow, on his knees, stiffened, and screamed. Perhaps I should say that he howled. In his voice was the inarticulate agony of a beast wounded to death. Then he collapsed. Both men stooped above him, cautious but thorough in their examination. Finally, Judge Purvisant straightened up and faced toward me. Keep Miss Susan there with you, he warned me. He's dead, and not a pretty sight. Slowly they came back to us. Purvisant was thoughtful, while O'Brien, Zoberg's killer, seemed cheerful for the first time since I had met him. He even smiled at me as Punch would smile after striking a particularly telling blow with his cudgel. Rubbing his pistol caressingly with his palm, he stowed it carefully away. "I'm glad that's over," he admitted. "My brother can rest easy in his grave." "And we have our work cut out for us," responded the judge. "We must decide just how much of the truth to tell when we make a report." O'Brien dipped his head in sage acquiescence. "You're right," he rumbled. "Yes, sir, you're right." "Would you believe me," said the judge, "if I told you that I knew it was Zoberg almost from the first?" But Susan and I facing each other were beyond being surprised, even at that.